The Intrepid-class light cruiser was built to serve as a lightning-fast vessel for use with the fleet as a scout, along the border as a patrol ship, or even serve as a mid-sized explorer suitable for trailblazing in new sectors. To do all this, the design team had two single mission briefs when they began designing the ship. She needed to be fast, and she needed to be reliable. And fast she would be. The Intrepid being capable of speeds as high as warp factor 9.97 at full power. This would make her the fastest ship in Starfleet history when commissioned, this being a title that she held until the Prometheus project produced the prototype Prometheus herself some years later. Aside from her speed, Intrepid was a capable light cruiser, being armed with Type 10 phaser arrays and 4 torpedo launchers in a 2-fore and 2-aft arrangement, with burst fire capability. Intrepid had a crew of roughly 200 under normal operating circumstances, with typical capabilities of a ship of her size, and could carry 4 to 6 shuttlecraft, aside from being equipped with a small captain's yacht located in the underside of the ship's saucer. The Intrepid class has one of the more convoluted development cycles for any starship in recent history. To start with, we must first look at the Cheyenne class of the 2250s. This ship was built as one of the Galaxy-class generation of starships, and was intended to serve in essentially the same role as the later Intrepid, being a fast scout ship and patrol vessel. To achieve this speed, Cheyenne used a tried-and-true method to allow such high warp speeds over prolonged periods. 2 independent pairs of warp nacelles, which could trade off from one another during flight when one pair got overheated as required. Unfortunately for Starfleet, the Cheyenne proved to be a trouble-prone failure. Shortly after the first ships of the class entered service, it was found that the ship's space frames were subject to unanticipatedly high levels of stress, causing microfractures all throughout the hull, which took several months to fix, and once repaired, could not be prevented from happening again as soon as the ship got up to speed again. This would force Starfleet to drastically cut back the number of Cheyenne-class ships built, while also limiting the vessels which had entered service to low warp speeds to preserve their space frames and prevent microfractures from spreading once again and endangering the ship's crews. But this would leave Starfleet lacking a fast scout and reconnaissance ship while this new vessel, what would eventually become the Intrepid class, was developed. And so, to serve as an interim measure, Starfleet would develop the Niagara-class cruiser. In essence, taking a spare Rigel-class cruiser space frame, there were several floating around, and crudely smacking on a new reactor and 3 nacelles, similar to those fitted aboard the Galaxy class to handle the added power. The resultant ship had a very limited shelf life, as it was essentially taking a 20-year-old hull and adding far more power than they were ever designed for. Make no mistake, the ships would fly themselves apart in short order, but before this happened, it was hoped that their replacement would be in service. So to recap, Starfleet had just built a deliberately badly designed cruiser to replace their accidentally badly designed cruiser, while the real replacement for that badly designed cruiser was being designed and tested in a way that hopefully would ensure that this cruiser was not badly designed. After all this was done, Starfleet would launch headlong into development of the new ship, settling on a number of novel design departures from the norm of Federation starship design, namely an elongated saucer section, overall stretched hull form, and alarmingly short and stubby nacelles. The ship's stretched form was designed with recent advances in subspace dynamics in mind, these tests showing that at very high warp stresses along the outer edges of a ship hull were unusually strong, and that the thinner the warp bubble a ship could project, the lower drag, and thus less power required to get to such high speeds, or to maintain high speed. The ship's nacelles, though, would be considered a marvel of technology when introduced, being developed alongside a system for varying the geometry of a ship's warp field. This would permit the nacelles to be much smaller in scale, with the technology for recalibrating warp coils individually to keep the nacelles aligned properly, and thus require fewer coils individually. The ship's warp drive would also have to be designed to take into account recently discovered issues regarding the damaging effects of warp fields upon subspace, with the Intrepid's warp field at cruising speeds being optimized to limit the damage done to subspace while in transit. As a final new technology demonstrated, the new ship would be the first vessel in the fleet to fully utilize new bio-neural computer technology to permit much faster working speeds, which was necessary given the demands the computer was to be put under, controlling the ship's radically new warp field geometry as it did, which would require much more frequent in-flight adjustments to keep the field stable than a field of the conventional style that was inherently quite stable. All of these radical new technologies in a single ship would have been alarming given the issues faced with the Cheyenne class, which was much more conservative comparatively. The vessel they were meant to replace being the Cheyenne. However, nothing used aboard the ship was totally new, the ship's warp field geometry having been tested at length over the preceding decade, bio-neural technology having been introduced in a limited scale across the fleet already. And while Intrepid was the first vessel to be built from the start to be less damaging to subspace while transiting, the principle had been demonstrated amply by the rest of Starfleet over the years the ship was being developed. So this was more like adding tested technology to a new ship, rather than adding new technology to a new ship, which is far more alarming. USS Intrepid would enter service in 2368 after successfully completing a slew of exhaustive trials meant to prove that the ship would not fly herself apart as the Cheyenne had. But, with Starfleet eventually satisfied with their new ship's sturdiness and overall acceptability, full-scale production of the other members of the class could begin. In service, the Intrepid class would prove to be a nearly instant hit with their crews, who found the ship to be a very capable, comfortable for her size range, and very effective ship with all the latest technology, which all helped the vessel and her crews to perform their missions effectively and quickly. With the class entering service immediately prior to first contact with the Dominion, it should come as little shock that a majority of the service performed by the class in their early years of service was done as part of Starfleet's efforts to increase its defenses in the event of a war with the Dominion. The ships performing border patrols along the Cardassian frontier and serving in various other missions as needed. It may come as a surprise to hear that, given the impressive capabilities of the Intrepid class, its high-speed, powerful computers, advanced sensors, and respectable arms and armament, that the design was not rushed into mass production in huge numbers alongside other classes such as the Steamrunner, Saber, Akira, and even the larger Sovereign class. But, of course, this was not the case. There were, in fact, a very good reason for this, at first absurd decision, as well as a secondary rationale, with the main reason being that Starfleet required hull numbers above all else, and that the Intrepid, despite its capabilities, was a time and resource-intensive ship to produce. The second reason was perhaps equally important for Starfleet, and that was that the Intrepid, in a scenario where nearly every ship built stood a decent chance of playing a role in a major fleet action, where speed was less important than overall survivability, and weapons loadout was only middle of the road, where both firepower and survivability were concerned, being armed at a level roughly comparable to the old Excelsior class, with inferior shielding to those ships in their wartime refits. This is not to say that the ship was useless in a fight, but that resources were, in the eyes of Starfleet, better spent on refitting Excelsiors as quickly as possible and producing more powerful new ships, such as the Akira class, which were judged to be more useful by Starfleet in the scenario of the Dominion War. As a result, while the initially intended production run of 45 Intrepids would be concluded, and an additional run of 35 ships approved, production of the class was not given terribly high priority, and was in fact kept at near peacetime levels. The Intrepids which did see service would be heavily engaged during the Dominion War. serving mostly as scout and patrol ships for larger fleets where their speed allowed them an advantage over enemy forces they encountered. Meaning that Intrepids took very light losses during the war, as they nearly always had the option of fleeing from a potential fight and messaging Starfleet to request reinforcements, rather than being forced into battle. A few ships were used to carry special diplomatic envoys throughout the war, with the Bellerophon carrying diplomats and ambassadors to Romulus at several points. Post-war production has been cut back on the class with just over 60 ships built, the class suffering a total of 8 losses during the war, among the lowest in Starfleet proportionally. The Intrepid class remains in service today, and although its crown as fastest ship in the fleet has been taken, and its speed less impressive than when commissioned, the ships are still easily among the fastest vessels in the galaxy, and Starfleet looks forward to making good use of the ships for many decades to come. And now, with the service of the class as a whole out of the way, some slight time will be taken to briefly go over the service of a particularly notable member of the class, which will get its own video at some point down the road, but deserves a mention here nonetheless. We are of course talking about the USS Voyager. One of the first Intrepid-class ships to be built, she would be in service by 2370 with Federation forces around Bajor. The ship would be ordered to pursue vessels operated by the Maquis rumored to be in the area of the Badlands. After reporting her position just outside of this tumultuous region of space, all contact with the vessel would be lost. And after extensive search efforts, she would be reported missing, presumed lost, in 2371. Unknown to Starfleet, and the Federation as a whole, Voyager was not lost. Well, she was, but she was not destroyed. She was lost to Starfleet, and over the next 7 years the ship would slowly make her way home, from the Delta Quadrant, where she had been stranded by a weird alien from another galaxy. It's a jungle out there. Along the way, she would encounter numerous new species, doing her best to represent the ideals and principles of the Federation wherever she traveled, to leave a good first impression, which could be followed up by subsequent exploratory ships in the future. The ship would face numerous perils along her way, including traversing through the heart of the Borg Collective, and when the vessel eventually returned home to the Federation, via Borg technology, the vessel was welcomed home with cheers and promptly decommissioned so that the technology she carried could be researched, studied, and learned from for future use in Starfleet. And besides, the ship's space frame was showing severe signs of wear after so long without a stay in dry dock for routine maintenance. Replacing a previously failed design and requiring a stopgap vessel to fill in during her development, the Intrepid-class light cruiser has proven to be a valuable addition to Starfleet, and more than lives up to the hopes of her designers by being a capable and highly effective ship exceeding all expectations in service. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to give it a like, comment about what you think of Star Trek Voyager. It's not my favorite series, but I do quite like it. It had its bright points. It's definitely one of the Star Trek series made. So if your thoughts differ, let me know with a comment. Also, let me know what you think about the artwork that was featured in this video. I've been trying to make some more artwork for the channel, for the videos that I release, and this is kind of the first one where I'm properly presenting them. So let me know what you think of the art style. There's kind of a style there. I think it counts as a style anyway. Yeah, do all that, and yeah, aside from that, I guess have a nice day. I don't know. I'm going to keep this kind of short because this was a giant video in terms of scripting, so you've probably listened to your fair share of my voice and want to be done. Okay, I'll go.